Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening and welcome to Woman. Our topic this evening is consciousness raising. My guests are Judy Sullivan. Judy is a writer and she helped organize one of the first consciousness raising groups in the country. She also participated in a radio series on consciousness raising for WBAI in New York. Her new book, Mama Doesn't Live Here Anymore, will be published in March of this year. Also with us is Claudia Dreifus. Claudia is a working journalist whose articles have appeared in McCalls, Cosmopolitan, and The Nation, and many other magazines. She is the author of a book that documents her own consciousness-raising group, and the book is titled Woman's Fate. Claudia is currently writing a book on divorce. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
I'd like to know, Judy, what first interested you in consciousness-raising?
Well, I read about it first when I was teaching at Washburn University in Kansas back in '69, I guess, and got very interested in it and read everything I could get my hands on, and then a group of my students and I started a group there. And then I came to New York the next year and got involved with the New York Radical Feminist and began organizing consciousness-raising groups for them, and was also in a group with them.
Claudia, how about you?
Well, I think my first contact with consciousness raising was when I was involved in a lawsuit in New York where 300 women sued the state to repeal what was then a very repressive abortion law. And I met a young woman who said, would you join our consciousness raising group? And I said, well, quite contemptuously, no, I don't believe in group therapy, just political action. And she said, it's not group therapy. And I put it aside for a long while. And then a group I was very, very active in, which was called Media Women, formed. And all of us felt we needed some kind of support to help each other, because all of us were pretty much the show-me woman at every place we worked in. We just had no contact with each other. And we started to do consciousness raising. And after that, it seemed to me like there was really a need for a book. Whenever I traveled around the country and gave speeches, women would ask me, how do I start a rap group? And so I kind of decided I'd do a history of one consciousness raising group to show by example how groups get started.
Let's go back to a couple of things. One, what is the difference between consciousness raising and group therapy?
Well, I think group therapy supposes that there is something wrong with the individual, and if the individual is unhappy and must be made to fit back into society. And consciousness raising works in the other direction. Yeah, you're all right. It's all right to be a woman, and if you're feeling bad and unhappy about what's happening to you, it's not because there's anything wrong with you. It's because of the situation you find yourself in. Wouldn't you agree?
I think it's that, and it does other things too. Group therapy is supposed to be a therapeutic process. Consciousness raising is supposed to be a political process. It really is the basic building block of the women's movement, and that's what makes the women's movement different from all other political movements. What we say is, in consciousness-raising groups, where women in groups of 5 and 10 sit down and discuss all the political issues of their lives that men have said were irrelevant, like how you feel about giving birth to a baby, how you feel about menstruation. Well, all these issues, we talk with each other, our experiences, and then we develop theory and an understanding of what has happened to us. I think, Judy, what we also develop is another thing. I don't know how you grew up, but I grew up kind of believing the myth that all other women were my enemies.
Yeah.
And in consciousness-raising groups, one of the things we learn is how really good women can be to each other.
Before we get into what you learn from it, let's get into how do you start a consciousness-raising group?
Well, there are a lot of ways to start one. What we have been doing in New York with the group that I work with is we have organizers for different areas of town. And the organizers' names are printed with their phone number in various places, and people call in to say they're interested in a consciousness-raising group, and when that organizer has enough names to form a group in a specific geographical area, then a meeting is called, and the organizer usually goes to the first 2 or 3 meetings and gets things off the ground. One thing I'd like to say before we get into that too much, though, about the difference between therapy and CR, the process itself is very different, just how you go about it. Therapy often means confrontation. It means a lot of things. And in CR, each woman speaks very subjectively from her own experience, and all the other women listen and they don't interrupt. And that's the thing I think that grabs women so much at first about CR, is that for the first time somebody is really listening to them and really cares about what they have to say. And for most of us, that has never happened before in our lives.
And just saying for the first time in your life, don't blame yourself for everything. Women have been taking the rap for everything since the time of Eve. And what we're saying is, let's talk together and figure out what society has done to each of us. I think what it really does, and what's most important, is break isolation. But what I'd like to address myself to is how to get groups started, because there are a lot of cities and a lot of towns where people don't have organizers.
I was just going to say
Yeah.
that. What do you do if you don't have someone to come in and teach you?
Well, pass out a leaflet in your building, mimeograph a leaflet, and put something under everybody's door saying, "Women, let's get together." All you need is 5 or 10 women. Take an ad in your local newspaper and say, "I am going to start a consciousness raising group. Are there any sisters out there?" Put up a sign at a school or a daycare center, anywhere
Or a
where
grocery store.
yeah, anywhere.
Laundromat.
Right.
I think a laundromat would be a terrific place.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I'm going to leave with you a list of topics that we have used very successfully in the general outline of how you do it. And so if people wanted to write in, would that be all right to get a copy of that?
I guess so.
Okay.
Let's go to the next step, though. After you've put up a sign in the laundromat and you get some response, what do you do then?
Well, you get the man out of the house. You give him $2 and you send him to the movies, or $2.50 these days. And it's very important for women to be among themselves to do that. You sit down in your living room and you use Judy's list, and you begin to explain how'd you get here, what it is in your life that brought you here. You talk about maybe an early subject like how you were raised as children. I think that's really important, because all of us were raised in a very certain way to be good little feminine girls, meaning that we couldn't climb trees or run too fast or excel too much. And examining these things really helps us examine our present lives and also the way we're raising our daughters.
How do most women react to the first session, or even the first subject? I know in your book you said that one of the first things you talked about was your childhood.
Yeah, well, it's easy to talk about childhood because that's far away or further away.
Yeah.
What becomes difficult for most women is talking about our lives now, because that demands a certain amount of political confrontation with, and I don't mean to use rhetoric, but with the forces that oppress us. And the forces that oppress us are a part of our lives. It's not very easy to say no to a boss who thinks of you as an all-time menial for everything. It's not easy to say no to a husband who doesn't necessarily respect you.
It's not easy to quit smiling.
Yeah. It's not easy to say to your children, "Listen, I'm not a servant." And sometimes a lot of women shy away from consciousness raising groups because they're afraid if they say no that they'll lose everything they've built in their lives. And it's a scary process.
Is each woman given a certain amount of time, and do you just go around the group and
you
let
form
each
a
woman
circle.
speak?
The classic form is to form a circle, and each woman speaks in turn. After the first session, you agree on the topics that are to be discussed the next week, so you have some time to think about it and get your thoughts together. And it's very important to speak about your own experience and how you felt about it. And no one questions that, because I can't say, "No, that's not what you felt, Claudia. Oh, that's wrong." You can't feel that way. So no one questions you, no one interrupts you. You just talk about your own experience one at a time, all the way around the circle. And then when you're through, then you begin to find the common experiences that you had and to talk about, well, to make the analysis, essentially. Why did this happen to us all in this particular way? Why were we all made to feel this way? And
then there's a group discussion then
Yeah.
after each woman speaks.
And I think overwhelmingly what you find is that there's a pattern to the things that have happened to us. And that pattern is a political oppression that we can define and understand.
Does everyone agree with you that consciousness raising groups are political?
Well, there is an attempt to distort them. I think, as in any good thing that happens, there's an attempt to commercialize it and co-opt it. And there are psychoanalysts everywhere who advertising consciousness-raising groups for women.
because it is an entirely different form of group interaction. It's very different from Well, it's different from rap groups even,
Yeah.
because people interrupt each other, and it's certainly different from the confrontation kind of group therapy that a lot of people are accustomed to dealing with. And so it's no wonder that psychologists are glomming onto it.
Psychologists are so fatty, you know, and any and anything that comes into their mind as a new thing, they get into. And I think we have to be very careful, because this is not a psychological process, this is a political process. Although people do feel better for participating.
Yeah.
What were your fears when you first began consciousness raising? Did you have any?
I don't know, I think probably Claudia and I started it so early that we didn't know what to be afraid
Yeah.
of. But later on in organizing groups, I found that many women were afraid of it. They would say, oh, if I go to this group, I'm afraid that I'll have to divorce my husband, or I'm afraid that I will have to start looking ugly, or all of these things that they would project as happening to them. And the fears are just, as Claudia said a little bit earlier, women have invested so much into their lives, into living their lives the way they were supposed to, they're really afraid of stopping.
It's true, though, that many divorces do come out of consciousness raising groups. You know, how do you
Well,
answer that?
I don't know. There are many divorces anyway in society. One of the myths I always hear is that the women's movement is increasing the divorce rate. Well, I doubt that it's true, because the divorce rate is enormous. The institution of marriage has never really worked, but it was always men leaving women. And what's happening now is that, perhaps because of consciousness raising, and I don't think it's a bad thing, some women are saying, this is an untenable marriage I'm in. I am going to get up and leave. I'm not going to invest any more time. I'm going to rebuild my life in a new way.
Yeah. I think consciousness raising in a group is just a speeded up process, really, because things happen to you all the time, all during your life, that raise your consciousness. Someone will be evil to you in the restaurant and then turn around and be very nice to a man, for example, and that raises your consciousness. But it's when you're all by yourself, it's a very slow process. You get in a group and it's bow, 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 bow. And so it does tend to kind of bring things together very quickly for you. And so there will be some changes in your life. That's part of it, and I think that's part of the fear, is that resistance to change that everybody has to some extent.
Also, if there's going to be change, you'll have people to help you see you through it.
Yeah, that's the most important part.
All right, let's get into what it feels like. Can you do that?
It's hard. It's almost very hard to describe it. Very, very painful. I think one of the things I began to fear at first and then begin to feel, so I always thought of myself as a very special woman, like all the definitions that apply to all other women don't apply to me. I'll make it no matter what. I'll do my thing. And I guess in earlier incarnations I had a lot of contempt for women. And I could never, you know, I was the one woman, I did masculine work, I was a union organizer. And when the women's movement and consciousness raising happened and I got into it, what it felt like was getting in touch with my femininity and understanding that I was female, relating to other women and not being afraid of them.
That's what I would like
Yeah.
you to describe, is this relationship with other women. This is what I hear most,
Yeah.
glowing terms
You
about
learn
the
to
experience.
trust. You learn to trust other women. And that, to me, I think is, well, two things were the greatest things that I got out of it. And the first was because just like Claudia, I always prided myself on doing a man's job. I thought I was an honorary man. And it took me a long time to
Yes.
figure out that I was just kind of like the mascot on the faculty. You know,
Absolutely.
I really wasn't really
Right.
one of them. And the idea that I could really be friends with women, of course I'd always had a few very close women friends, but very few, and we always kind of apologized to each other for being friends with each other, which just makes me sick now. But that, and then this tremendous sense of energy that I got, not only from being in touch with myself and finally figuring out just exactly why I was the way I was, but having a real commitment to change it and knowing that all those women were behind me and with me and wanting to do the same thing. And that energy is still something that I draw on, and it's wonderful.
I understand. The thing that I'd like to know next is, what about the pitfalls? All right, you're in the group, you've spoken with each other many, many times. What happens to the group along the way? What are some of the problems?
Well, there's always a woman in every group who begins every statement by saying, no matter how horrible tales of oppression people will recite, she will begin by saying, oh, we must forgive men are oppressed too. And it happens in every group.
Yeah.
How
And
do
it
you
happens
answer
in
her?
well, within my group that's in my book, you know, we sat through about 5 or 6 sessions with one of our sisters reciting this litany of prayer and forgiveness to most men. And finally, the whole group broke all the rules of consciousness raising, and we just attacked her terribly. And we said, you know, listen, we know men are oppressed, and we feel very sorry for them, and we know how they suffer because they all have to be John Wayne. But that isn't our concern. How are you oppressed, Susan, we said. And it really sort of broke her up. But I think that was a confrontation we had to have, and it happens in almost every group. I think everywhere women have to stop apologizing for men and always forgiving men for everything they do.
Yeah.
I think there's a point here that we should make that we forgot. You suggest that only women are in consciousness raising groups. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah. Women just talk very differently to each other. We have our own language, which is beautiful. When men are around, women tend to shade what they say. I've noticed this time and time again. It's just become glaringly obvious to me. When you are talking with a group of women and a man walks up, stop, subject
The
gets
mask
changed.
goes on.
The mask goes on. That's it, the mask. That's
But
perfect.
something else. I think women, when there's a man in the room, by conditioning, often tend to compete for that man. And the other thing is that men have never experienced the very basic things we're talking about. What man can tell me anything about childbirth or menstruation or what it's like to be a woman? He cannot. And we
can only learn from ourselves and each other. It's just
And that's really what it's all about,
Yeah.
you think. What are some of the other pitfalls, Claudia?
Well, I think theorizing about vague utopias, I mean, I think a lot of things happen in groups, and everyone sort of says, well, wouldn't it be a wonderful world if men and women were equal? That's a way of avoiding your own life and thinking about what the world will be 200 years from now. It is very important for women to come into close contact with the things that have happened in their own life and not to fantasize about the future. We've got to make the future.
or even fantasize about the things that have happened to them.
Yeah.
I remember on one CR that we did on BAI about childbirth, we found in making the tape that many of us had for a long time fantasized about giving birth as being a beautiful experience simply because we were always told that it was supposed to be and that it really was. And then when we started CR, nearly every one of us started by saying, well, it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me. And then we recited this litany of abuse that we got all during the whole process. It should be one of the most wonderful things that happens to you if you choose to do that. But the way it's done is the things that are done to you when you're going through the process are pretty awful. And we tend to block those out and not remember them anymore. And that's true, I think, of just about everything you talk about in CR. You fantasize your past to fit some preconceived notion of what it was supposed to be like so that you won't be different from other people.
Is it a long, slow process, or do things happen very quickly? Do realizations come quickly?
I think sometimes they do. They come like lightning. Sometimes, really. I can think of a few that I had that were just devastating to me with their suddenness. It was just like being clapped up the side of the head with a 2x4. You know,
Anything
think,
that you would care to repeat?
Yeah, I remember one about specifically that we had about faking climax. I remember that one being a very riveting kind of experience.
Well, in our group, in the book, what we all had a session on the subject of rape, and all of us sat down and we said, well, what are we talking about this for? None of us have been raped. And then everybody started sitting down and thinking about what was considered normal social contact with men, dating, and Susan could tell about the time when she was introduced to a perfectly normal, average all-American boy who left her in a field in Philadelphia, and one of the women in the group could remember about a boy she was dating who left her parked in a fraternity in Brooklyn, and everyone could recite instances that involve force. And we all sat down and we said, well, you know, maybe we haven't got legal definitions of rape, but wow, there's an awful lot of force that goes on in normal sexual relationships. And that was a big shock.
Yeah.
And we would have never known it hadn't we compared notes. Men often compare notes, but I think they lie.
Now we'll have to give them equal time. A lot of people say that consciousness-raising sessions are bitch sessions, sort of, that people, complain only. Do you feel there's any substance at all to this charge?
Well, there's a lot to complain about.
Yeah.
I think that, no, I think that's a very strange way to put it, because when you're talking about what your life was like and what it meant to you, you don't complain, because most people's lives are not all misery, even women. There are joyful things, and you begin to see that some of those joyful things are maybe joyful for some of the wrong reasons. But I don't see how you could call them complaint sessions. Do you, Claudia?
No, I think there's a lot of criticism of consciousness raising because in a sexist society, people are very afraid of what happens when women get alone together.
Yeah,
there's
it's
just
dangerous.
a fear of us having our own territory, and there's a lot of fantasy about what goes on in those sessions. But most of all, there's fear. During the French Revolution, or afterwards, when they wanted to halt the radical strivings of the French Revolution, Robespierre banned meetings by women in groups of more than 5. I think that these kind of accusations are similar attempts. No one wants us to get together and really talk to each other. They want to keep us isolated in our little suburban cubbyholes, each with our own washing machine and our own electric oven, so we'll never know what our lives really mean.
Well, I think men are afraid, and this is just from the groups that I've known, of what women say about them specifically, and perhaps with good reason. I can remember the first co-ed party I ever went to with feminists and with my consciousness-raising group, and after a couple of years we decided, well, we would invite our men friends, and it was so funny at that party because women would come in and so-and-so would say, I'd like for you to meet my friend Charlie, and you couldn't help but say that. You'd say, Charlie! And they knew, but they didn't really know. If they had had any idea, really, they wouldn't have come to the party.
I was just going to say,
Probably.
you have to give them credit for coming.
Yeah.
Claudia, there was an interesting thing in your book, the Speak Bitterness sessions of the Chinese women.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, well, in China during the revolution they had there, previous to it, women were an exceptionally oppressed class with bound feet and female slavery. And one of the forces that made that revolution was the fact that as Mao's armies went into the towns, Mao's armies and the women would get all the women of the town together and say, please tell us about your lives. The women would gather in the town squares and they would recite the bitterness of their lives, which is what they called it. And they would tell their life stories, and then they would go back and confront the husbands who had beat those women and the fathers who had sold their daughters into slavery. And they would make the men come forth and swear rectitude. And it was women who made the Chinese Revolution. And it'll be women who create great changes here, too.
Can you describe the varying philosophies about consciousness raising?
Well, there's some people who'd like to see it as psychoanalysis and very weak and just a therapeutic process. There are people like Judy and myself who really feel it's a political process. We will learn what feminism really means by examining our lives, not by examining textbooks.
What would be some things for women to watch out for, in your opinion?
Well, for people who use psychological jargon, I'm not opposed to psychology and to psychoanalysis per se, but anyone who applies words like Oedipus complex to what is essentially a question of job oppression or inability to get equal wages, watch out for that person. Watch out for anyone who tends to over-monopolize a discussion. Watch out for people who utopiaize too much.
Does a consciousness-raising group have to have a leader?
No, it shouldn't have a leader. I think that every session, what we've usually found works pretty well is that whoever's house it is usually sort of responsible for being sure that everybody stays on the subject and doing it in a nice way. And someone, of course, has got to be responsible for doing the calling and getting everybody together. But that's usually shifted around,
It depends. I think in some situations there should be no leader. In others, people feel more comfortable with having a starter come in and sort of just be a cohesive force.
Yeah.
There really shouldn't be a rule about that one way or the other.
Yeah,
Did that cause you problems when you were doing your group because of the book?
Yeah, well, I did function as a leader in that, and I found it very oppressive to be the leader. I didn't want to be. But it also made the group very cohesive, and we, for instance, we didn't digress very much. We didn't get into too many abstractions because we did have a purpose, and that helped.
Yeah, that would help.
What about the lifespan of a group?
They seem to have a natural lifespan. They, when you've gone through all the topics, you decide, for the most part, women decide, all right, now we've talked about this, we all feel differently about ourselves, we all like ourselves and each other much better than we ever had in our whole life, and now it's time to do something about that. It's time to act on this very strong feeling. And so very often the group will become some other kind of group. Most of the women who were in my original conscious raising group in New York have formed a videotape collective now. And so we're doing something else, but we're all still together. It's, even when the group disbands, it's still your family, sort of. You can always count on these women.
Yeah. Women shouldn't feel guilty about groups having sort of a natural lifespan and not going on in perpetuity, but just having a lifespan, say, of a year. They just seem to have that natural lifespan. Some go on 4 years, some go on 3 months. But the natural span seems to be
never
once.
even get off the ground, for that matter. You may have just a conflict of personality, so it's just never going to work. And but for the most part, they do go on for a while, because you get very attached to these women.
If you had doubts about the process, what might they be?
That it's very hard to move from the consciousness raising into political action. That moment after you've gone through all the list of topics, the moment when it comes to act, that step is the hardest step to take.
Now, is that an absolute step that has to be taken?
It should be taken. There are small things that happen that don't happen on an overt political process. In my group, several women went out and got jobs that they were more qualified for than the jobs they had in the past. Now that's very political, and yet it's not a group thing. But in another group, women got together and they seized the Ladies' Home Journal one day. The offices, and that was a real consciousness-raising action. It really depends, but to move that step.
Claudia and Judy, I'm sorry we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming. Good night from Woman. See you next week.